Okay, I'm just want to tell everyone who's on Zoom, I'm going to mute you, but if you unmute yourself, please make sure that you stay quiet. Last time there was a lot of distraction on. So it is being recorded, and I'm just going to share a screen here. There you go. And again, welcome.
Is there any way we can just get it so it? Yeah, can we go to slideshow?
That's all. I'm just going to get rid of it so that you don't have it.
Well, if you go to slideshow, right?
They will.
Go to there, slideshow.
Okay.
Yeah, and then press that, and then go from current slide. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. And then that should put it right up on the screen now. Are they still going to be able to see it?
Yep. Yes.
Are they?
Yes. Okay. I'm going to check on my phone. Okay. So can you thank? Yeah, I'm going to. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and whoever's on Zoom. We are going to start. I'm not going to introduce Angus because everyone knows him. That's why they're here.
Thank you, Rabbi. And thank you, everybody. I think just about everybody who was here 2 weeks ago is back. So and we've got some extras. Hi, Marty. How you doing? It's nice to see you. Thank you for coming. So great. And I'm just going to double check with the rabbi to make sure that the people out there in Zoom land can actually see me. So is he there? Rabbi, can they see me? Okay. All right. Okay, so we finished last week with the rise of Islam and not only the rise of Islam, but the expansion of Islam. So what we're going to do this week, or what we're going to start with this week, is kind of this very quick trip over the next 15 minutes or so over the kind of the ensuing 1,000 years after the rise and expansion of Islam, but with a particular focus on Jewish history. And then we're gonna sort of end up eventually in the Holy Land, in Israel and Palestine, however we want to refer to it. So after the brief interregnum, and I won't really go into it, but the Crusader occupation of the Holy Land, and that's certainly what Christians were referring to it as during the Crusader period. In about 1250, Palestine, what we think of as Palestine, came under the control of the Mamluk dynasty, which was a Muslim military elite that was centered in Cairo and Damascus. And then in the 16th century, around 1516, 1517, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, Central Asian Muslims who had conquered the old Christian Byzantine Empire based in Constantinople, drove the Mamluks out of Palestine and effectively incorporating Palestine into their Ottoman Empire as part of a huge swath of territory. And it was administered, Palestine in the 16th century up until relatively recently, close to our own time, was administered by Damascus and included what we would now call parts of Syria and Lebanon. So what is sometimes referred to as the Levant, the Middle Eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And Bernard Lewis, the great British American scholar of Islam, and specifically medieval Islam, always said that remarkably, this was a society that worked. There was, and I'm going to go to the next slide here. Here we go. There was a small but significant, we actually looked at this map last week. There was a small but nevertheless significant Jewish demographic in Palestine, centered to a certain extent around Jerusalem, but very much around up here in the Galilee, around the city of Sfat and Tiberias and so on. And Muslims and Jews and Christians under the Ottoman Empire worshipped and studied side by side. The different communities essentially administered themselves in terms of their legal traditions, in terms of cultural practices, laws around death and marriage and inheritance. Everybody kind of found ways of working together. And as Sunni Muslims, specifically Ottomans, viewed Christians and specifically Jews as what they call dhimmis, which is actually an Arab word, which means people of the book, or an Arabic word, which means people of the book. And they were fully protected under the laws of the Ottoman Empire. And I think, you know, it's important, to note that in these times, and this is probably a picture from around 1890, many people will recognize it. It's the Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem, still looks very much like that. The Tower of David is just back here, and then this is the gate that takes you right into the Armenian quarter there. But when you look at old photographs of Palestine at this time, it's not that easy to tell the difference between between Muslims and Jews, right? Now, this is a group of Yemeni Jews. This is taken many years later in the 1940s, but this is a group of Yemeni Jews who have just walked across the desert. But when you look at the people, I mean, you can't really see them as well in this photograph, but certainly in this photograph of the Yemeni Jews, it's very, very difficult to tell Arabs and Jews apart. But broadly speaking, Jews were at this time an educated class, prominent in business and in the professions, although they also lived on the land, and many were desperately poor. And Arabs often lived as a kind of rural peasantry known as fellahin, often working on working land that was owned by absentee landlords, effendis as they were called in the Ottoman Empire, that lived in other parts of the empire. They probably lived in Damascus. They probably lived in Cairo. Many of them may even have lived in Europe. So, and they were often exploited by their landlords. We're talking about Arab laborers here, exploited by their landlords, exploited by Ottoman officials, saddled with debt. And so Arabs in sort of 18th, 19th century in Palestine were in a very similar situation to sharecroppers in 19th and 20th century America. So that's kind of a very quick overview of the kind of the cultural situation, the political situation in Palestine, and we're certainly going to come back to that and dive into it in a lot more, or dive a lot more deeply into it. But for Jews in the diaspora, especially in Europe, this 1,000 years between the Crusades and the beginning of the 20th century was both highly eventful and deeply traumatic. So to go back to the Crusades, which are normally associated with the Holy Land, with Palestine, but the Crusades also involved a sustained series of attacks on Jewish communities throughout Europe, as Christians were enjoined to attack the infidel within. You don't have to go all the way to the Holy Land to kill infidels when we've got infidels right here. So there were massacres, there were massive pogroms in cities like Mainz, in cities like Hamburg, all these cities down along the Rhine. And it's also important to remember that Jews actually in the Holy Land and who were confronting crusaders, this is a lost part of history, is that Jews fought alongside Muslims at places like Jerusalem, at places like Jaffa, at places like Ascalon, as it was called then, defending the Holy Land, defending their land, defending Muslim and Jewish land against these marauding crusader armies. And despite an important flowering of Jewish culture, to move on a little bit from the Crusades, in centers like Vilnius, we've all heard of the Vilna Gaon, places like Krakow, and apparent emancipation in countries like Britain and France and Germany, huge numbers of Jews were poor villagers living under the constant threat of violence. So, you know, we've got the Vilna Gaon, and we've also got, you know, life in the shtetl, which could be, you know, to quote Locke, nasty, brutish, and short. And then, of course, the other thing that was going on was the so-called Reconquista in Spain, when the Catholic rulers, Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the sponsors of, as we know, of Christopher Columbus, took back the last remnants of Islamic territory in Spain, parts of which had been under Arab or Moorish rule since around the 8th century of the Common Era. So Jews who were very well integrated into Muslim communities in Spain were seen by Spain's Catholic rulers, especially as they reconquered what had previously been Muslim and Jewish space. Jews were seen by Catholic rulers as part of Spain's kind of Moorish problem, and they were forced to either convert to Christianity or die. And many chose to die, Kiddush Hashem. They were burned at the stake after being tortured by the Inquisition. Others converted in name and form, but continued to practice Judaism. And by the time it was over, sort of circa 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, historians estimate that around 300,000 Jews, around a quarter of Spain's Jewish population at the time, either converted, been expelled from Spain, or were tortured or burnt to death by the Inquisition. There's somebody at the door. Can we make it in there?
Okay.
Yeah. So that's Spain. And then around 1648, there was a Cossack uprising in the Eastern European heartland of what is now Eastern Poland, Byelorussia, and Ukraine, which united Cossack bands and Ukrainian peasant irregulars against their Polish overlords. And it was primarily based, this uprising was primarily based on the view of both Polish aristocrats and Jews as colonizers, as outsiders, as invaders, people who are racially not our people. So the Cossacks and the Ukrainian peasants were determined to rid Ukraine of them all. And I don't know how many people here are fans of Isaac Bashevis Singer, but he wrote an amazing novel called Satan in Gore, which deals with this time, the time of the Cossack uprising. And in Satan in Gore, he evokes the devastation that arose from these waves of pogroms that accompanied this 17th century uprising in, again, what is now Poland, Western Ukraine, or Ukraine and Western Russia. And he writes, in the year 1648, the wicked Ukrainian hetman, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and his followers besieged the city of Zamość, but could not take it because it was heavily fortified. The rebelling peasants moved on to spread havoc in Tomashov, in Bilgorod, in Krasnik, in Turbin, Frampol, and in Gore too, the town that lay in the midst of the hills at the end of the world. They slaughtered on every hand. They flayed men alive. They murdered small children. They violated women and afterwards ripped open their bellies and sewed cats inside. Many fled to Lublin. Many underwent baptism or were sold into slavery. And Jewish mortality during the Cossack uprising, the Khmelnytsky uprising, was incredibly disproportionate. Out of a total Eastern European population in the mid-17th century of about 1.3 million people, this was very much the center of certainly European Jewish life at that time. Out of this population of 1.3 million, an estimated 100,000 were murdered. So that means about 7.5% of the Jews of Europe were murdered. And it's not comparable, obviously, to the Holocaust in absolute numbers, but its impact is certainly comparable in terms of cruelty and barbarism. So this was followed in that part of the world by the rise of what I kind of call pogrom culture in the 18th and 19th century Russian Empire, where 40% of the world's Jews about 5 million people lived, because there were still these massive kind of movements of Jews around Europe, and eventually finding themselves in this kind of strip of land between what we now call Poland and Prussia and Russia proper, known as the Pale of Settlement. And it's actually depicted on one of the stained glass windows here. And historian and ethnographer, the late 19th century Jewish historian and ethnographer Simon Dubnoff called Russia the Jewish Dark Continent. And he did that for a reason. And a lot of that was because of this pogrom culture. And pogrom, the word is derived actually from a Russian word for thunder. And it refers to mass violence that is directed specifically against Jews, against their communities, against their households and possessions. And pogroms, I mean, sometimes, and even in film, like Fiddler on the Roof, for example, but we have to remember that pogroms were not about kind of petty vandalism. They were not about breaking windows, looting shops, or about small boys kind of chucking rocks at any Jew that happened to find themselves out on the street after dark. What pogroms were orgies. I mean, absolute orgies of slaughter and destruction and rape. And writing about the great Kishinev pogrom, which is kind of the pogrom by which so many others are measured, which took place in Moldavia in 1903, so 120 years ago, which is not that long ago. The historian Stephen Zipperstein tells us that Jews, quote, were beaten to death, smashed on the heads with enamel sinks, others literally torn apart with crowbars. Their bodies were tossed onto the street, some covered, and to further humiliate them with chicken feathers. And by the time this particular pogrom was over, and these are actual newspaper photographs from the aftermath of the Kishinev pogrom, about 50 Jews were dead, hundreds more were injured, and at least 40 women had been raped, although unofficial estimates of the extent of sexual violence are actually much, much higher. So, this is really interesting, and I'm making this point because, when we read about what happened on October the 7th in Israel, people, it's often said that, well, this was the most violent thing to ever happen to a Jewish community anywhere since the Shoah, since the Holocaust, right? But the point I'm trying to make here, or one of the points I'm trying to make, is that this actually the trauma that's associated with October the 7th actually goes much, much, much deeper than the Holocaust. I mean, certainly the Holocaust, that shared experience, that folk memory is certainly active here, but we're also talking about hundreds of years of this as well. So anyway, so there we are. Then something truly monumental happens. 1894. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, he's a French army officer. He's the only Jew on the French general staff, and that's probably quite important, is accused and convicted of passing military secrets to Germany, despite all kinds of perjured testimony, despite trumped up evidence, and the clear guilt of a third party. And this gave rise to widespread and deeply shocking anti-Semitism in France, which was supposedly the most emancipated and assimilated Jewish community in Europe. And these are some contemporary political cartoons or editorial cartoons depicting Dreyfus. And again, this is 120 years ago. And these caricatures, they denounce him as a Judas, and there were crowds in the streets baying, death to Dreyfus, death to the Jew. And one of the witnesses to the madness of the Dreyfus affair was a guy called Theodor Herzl, and he was an Austrian journalist, and he was a bon vivant, and he was an extremely secular Jew. And we also share a birthday. That's my claim to fame, is that Theodore Herzl and I share a birthday. But Herzl had long recognized the power of anti-Semitism. I mean, he was, after all, Austrian. But the Dreyfus affair truly, truly horrified him. And he began thinking of the Jewish question, as he called it, in terms of solutions, right? Rather than just as a problem or as a series of problems, he began trying to come up with solutions. And in a famous 1896 essay, I mean, probably the essay by which he is known best, called Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish state, he writes, the Jewish question still exists. It would be foolish to deny it. It exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers. Where it does not yet exist, it will be brought by Jews in the course of their migrations. We naturally move to those places where we're not persecuted, and there our presence soon produces persecution. This is true in every country and will remain true even in those most highly civilized. France itself is no exception, till the Jewish question finds a solution on a political basis. So you know where we're going with this, right? So at the first Zionist Congress, which Herzl organized a year later in Basel, in Switzerland, in 1897, he announced the founding of what he called the Zionist organization. And that would eventually become very, very quickly the World Zionist Organization, as sort of more and more Jews from all different parts of the world started kind of getting involved in this. And so Herzl defined Zionism, and the definition, I think, rings as true today as it did then, very simply as a movement with political, social, and religious elements devoted to the reestablishment and now concerned with the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. So that's kind of a gloss on Herzl. And although, this definition obviously contains entire worlds, and we also have to remember that this is very much a Eurocentric definition of Zionism, right? So this does not include the hopes and aspirations of Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews. Anyway, we'll get to that. But certainly Zionism, I think, without being called Zionism, has really been around for a long time. And I think Herzl, if he were here with us, would probably agree to one degree or another, but it's been around for a long time, certainly going back to the destruction of the temple by the Romans, which we talked about last week in 70 of the Common Era. But until Herzl came along, it was passive. It was largely passive. I wouldn't say it was all passive, but there was a passivity to it, and it was being expressed through prayer, mourning, hoping, and trying to sort of send support to small surviving Jewish communities in Palestine, often under the auspices of well-known Jewish philanthropists like the Rothschild family, like Sir Moses Montefiore, like Moritz, the Baron de Hirsch, to whom this congregation owes its existence. But what Herzl was proposing was nothing less than a Jewish homeland, right? A Jewish nation state, roughly, in his estimation, roughly within the bounds of biblical Israel. So what Herzl did was, and this I think is why he's such a revolutionary character and really kind of central to so much of what we've been talking about and so much of the way the world is today, and certainly the way the Jewish world is. What Herzl did was transform Zionism from this kind of passive mourning to activism, right? Because his goal was the establishment of a country where Jews would be safe. And unlike even emancipated, assimilated France, a country where Jews would be safe and able to determine their own future rather than having it determined for them. And his historical timing was absolutely impeccable, because European Jews, especially those in the East, in Russia and so on, and I would say that for most of us, and many of us in this room, part of the reason we're sitting here tonight is because our grandparents and our great-grandparents were fleeing from pogrom culture in Eastern Europe. And so Eastern European Jews were desperate to get out. Between 1900 and 1914, in the 15 years between the turn of the century and the beginning of the First World War, 1.5 million Jews left the Russian Empire. Most of them were headed for America, as this lovely old New Year's card, Rosh Hashanah card, depicts. So you have these very prosperous looking American Jews on one side, and their benighted relatives from Russia, and they're saying, "Come, join us. You know, come to the Golden Medina and be happy." But most of them were headed for America. But there was this core of them, inspired by Herzl and other influential Zionist thinkers, who saw the Jewish future not in America, not in Canada, or any of it, or England or Australia, but in Palestine. And many of them were socialists and idealists who envisioned Herzl's proposal for a Jewish state as an opportunity to create an egalitarian utopia, you know, and you know, that some of that utopianism still exists. I spend from time to time on a kibbutz in the Galilee, and it was founded by old Bolsheviks. And every morning you still gather around the flagpole and sing the Internationale, and there's a big portrait of Lenin in the dining room. So, but others were far more pragmatic and conservative, but they were all steeped in Jewish history and culture and faith. And even the secular among them understood Palestine to be the homeland and the fountainhead of Jewish faith, Jewish life, and ultimately of modern Jewish history. So beginning in around 1890, so actually a little before Herzl, who was not the first Zionist activist, but probably rather the most articulate and most successful, Jewish immigrants began arriving in Palestine at an unprecedented rate. And it's important to understand the demographic implications of this, right? Because this is going to become very important in our talk here in a couple of minutes. In the 19th century, the Jewish population of Palestine increased ninefold, from 7,000 people, around 7,000 people, according to the Ottoman census data, to 43,000 people, right? So it expanded basically in the last couple of decades of the 19th century from 2.5% to 15% of the total population of Palestine. And by 1914, the beginning of the First World War, it doubled to 94,000 people. So if you look at these two maps, I'm sorry, if I teach this class in more of a formal classroom setting, I have map packages, but I'm never quite sure how many people are coming. But I'm happy to send some of these maps if you want to get in touch with me. So this is an interesting pairing of maps, because this shows the Jews of Palestine basically from 660 to 1889. And we looked at this map earlier in today's class, and you can see these areas of Jewish settlement. So there's certainly areas of Jewish settlement in Palestine, but then you look at Jewish settlement in Palestine basically from the end of where this map leaves off until 1914, and you can see that suddenly all of these little dots, these are all Jewish towns and settlements that are expanding all over Palestine. And so early Zionist arrivals began purchasing land, often again funded by philanthropy and by charitable organizations like the Jewish National Fund, which is more than a charitable organization now. I mean, it's almost an empire unto itself. And so they were purchasing land kind of as the Ottoman state was weakening. And many of these large absentee landowners, like in places like Damascus and Constantinople and Cairo and Europe, Paris, you know, that kind of thing, they were happy to get rid of all of this property that was depreciating in value, because really Palestine in those days was the backwater of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, people really didn't want to be there. And so this kind of really accelerated the early Zionist ideal, which was reclaiming the land of Israel, right? More and more, they're referring to it not so much as Palestine, but it's the land of Israel, and creating a true Jewish society through Jewish labor on the land, essentially encouraging all of these urban and shtetl dwellers from Eastern Europe to establish a physical and emotional bond with the land. It's more than just working the land. It's like being the land, becoming the land, right? And in the early days, especially, most of these incomers, these European incomers, were happy to work alongside Arabs, mainly because the Arabs actually knew what they were doing, or to lease land back to the Arabs so they weren't displaced from their traditional farms. But many of the utopian Jewish socialist groups envisioned an egalitarian Jewish society that either excluded Arabs or existed kind of in parallel to Arab society. And so the time, right, again, we're talking the early 20th century, this had the makings of a perfect storm because there was something else that was going on in the world, and specifically in this part of the world in the late 19th and early 20th century, and that was the rise of Arab nationalism. So Arab scholars and intellectuals, some of whom were Christian, were traveling to Europe. They were traveling, they were studying in European universities. They were being exposed to European political thought, particularly revolutionary and nascent anti-colonial ideology. And the influence in particular of American Protestant missionaries coming into the Levant, coming into Palestine, partly out of their own fascination with the Holy Land, the land of Jesus, but also as a sort of vanguard of American expansionism, because remember, America was certainly, the United States was certainly an expansionist power at this time. They saw this as a way of kind of weakening. They weren't interested so much in converting Arabs as they were in weakening the Ottoman Empire with the power of ideas. And it was this kind of influx of American Protestant missionaries with this sort of evangelizing manifest destiny and all of that kind of thing that were the origins of things like the American University of Beirut, the American University of Cairo. So as the influx of European Jews continued, early Arab nationalists whose focus was liberation from Ottoman rule saw Zionism, or started to see Zionism, as a foreign and a European movement, which was really an attempt by Western powers to subordinate Arabs and Muslims to Europeans. And I'm going to read to you from a document called The Awakening of the Arab Nation by Naguib Azuri, who was an Ottoman bureaucrat who became quite a very well-respected and very influential Muslim thinker, and really one of the true intellectual drivers of this kind of Arab awakening. And in 1905, he wrote, "Two important phenomena of the same nature but opposed, which have still not drawn anyone's attention, are emerging at this moment in Asiatic Turkey," right, which includes Palestine. "They are the awakening of the Arab nation and the latent effort of the Jews to reconstitute on a very large scale the ancient kingdom of Israel. Both these movements are destined to fight each other continually until one of them wins. The fate of the entire world will depend on the final result of the struggle between these two peoples representing two contrary principles." Now, I don't want to assign value judgments on this, but this is very familiar sounding language, and this is language that is, again, it's a little bit more than 100 years old. But I think that this is we're already sort of starting to see the origins of conflict here, and I think that virtually all of these new Zionist arrivals, right, these people, the Jews who were trying to reconstitute the kingdom of Israel, the fact that they were virtually all fleeing Western powers, right, where they were vilified and persecuted, was kind of lost on a lot of Arab thinkers who only saw Zionism as a threat to their own existence and Zionists as interlopers. And the other thing that was happening at this time was the emergence of a specifically Palestinian Arab identity. And this comprised both Arab Muslims and many Arab Christians as well. And in 1911, a newspaper associated with the Arab nationalist movement was established in Jaffa, and it was called Palestine. And you can see this little newsboy here is selling Palestine, and it actually says it, and it's actually in French, because this was part of, everything was run from Damascus at this time, so French was already being spoken in Syria. So it says La Palestine. So this newspaper was stressed local nationalist interests rather than any allegiance to the Ottoman Empire, and it referred to Palestine as a national entity, right? It referred to Palestine as a kind of an Arab national entity, and importantly to its readers, all of whom were Christian and Muslim Arabs, as Palestinians. So this is when the sort of the idea of Arabs as Palestinians or Palestinians as Arabs sort of started to take fruit. So an identity and both an identity and a concept was born. So in the middle of all of this, as if there wasn't enough going on, right? It was the First World War, which began in 1914. I just need to drink some water. And so you had the allied nations of Great Britain, France, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the USA, as usual, the United States, as usual, took their sweet time getting involved, pitted against Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which, as we've already noted, was already kind of on its last legs due to corruption, lethargy, mismanagement, to say nothing of these stirrings of Arab and Jewish nationalism, which were making not only Palestine, but other parts of the Middle East or other parts of the Ottoman Middle East very, very difficult to manage. And Great Britain had a particular interest in the Middle East. Great Britain was already a colonial power in Egypt. And like Alexander the Great, saw the Levant and kind of the Middle East beyond it as this kind of gateway to, of course, the vast British Empire in India, in Southeast Asia, and in Australia. But it was also bogged down in the meat grinder, quite literally, of the Western Front. And so it couldn't defeat the Ottomans in the Middle East on its own. Therefore, in a series of agreements guaranteeing Arab sovereignty after the war was over, Britain was able to enlist a number of Arab rulers in the so-called Arab Revolt, which began in 1916. And so these pledges of support for Arab independence and Arab sovereignty were apparently quite heartfelt. So I'll quote from correspondence between Sheriff Hussein ibn Ali and Sir Henry McMahon, who was the British governor in Egypt. And Sharif Hussein, of course, is well known to all of us Lawrence of Arabia fans. There he is with his friend T.E. Lawrence. No, you're right. That's his son. You're right. You're absolutely right. I stand corrected. And he says, subject to the above modifications, Great Britain is prepared to recognize and support the independence of the Arabs in all the regions within the limits demanded by the Sharif of Mecca. Great Britain will guarantee the holy places against all external aggression and will guarantee their inviolability. I am convinced that this declaration will assure you beyond all possible doubt of the sympathy of Great Britain toward the aspirations of her friends, the Arabs, and will result in a firm and long-lasting alliance, the immediate result of which will be the expulsion of the Turks from the Arab countries and the freeing of Arab peoples from the Turkish yoke, which for so many years has pressed heavily upon them. And one of the best known figures in the revolt, of course, was T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, who fought alongside the Arab Legion, as it was called, as an advisor and as a liaison with the British command in Cairo. So the revolt was a success. It was a rout for the Ottoman Empire in the region and a major precipitating factor in its defeat and eventual collapse. But the problem was that what the Arabs and their champion T.E. Lawrence did not know was that Britain had much larger ambitions for the region than a series of Arab kingdoms divided along tribal lines, essentially replicating the pre-Ottoman political landscape. And as above, the opportunity to divide spoils in the wake of an exhausting and costly war and add significantly to an already existing empire. So between colonialism and economic hegemony, essentially bringing all of Asia into the British sphere of influence. And in 1916, a British Near East scholar named Mark Sykes and a French diplomat, Charles-Georges Picot, hammered out an agreement basically on how France and Britain would divide and rule the former Ottoman Empire after its defeat. And basically, the Sykes-Picot agreement was an almost complete reversal of the promises that were made in the correspondence between Sir Henry McMahon and Hussein. And it set the stage for the division of the Levant into two spheres of control, which we can see on this map here. Syria and Lebanon going to France, the other Palestine, and the other sphere of control would be Jordan and Palestine, or what they call Transjordan and Palestine, going to Britain. So it was a complete betrayal. It was a complete betrayal of all the promises that had been made to Arab allies throughout the war. And this photograph of Lawrence, of the two of them together, is very telling, because they're just coming out of the Versailles Conference, where they've learned what's about to happen in the Middle East, and the shock on especially on the prints here, the shock on their faces is palpable. So I think we have to sort of remember the larger historical context here. The First World War was a slaughterhouse. I mean, we know that. And, Allied victory was by no means assured. And think about it, until April of 1917, so a little bit more than a year, well, a year and a half before the war ended, the United States had nothing to do with it. They were deeply isolationist. Russia, which was keeping Germany and Austria-Hungary kind of distracted on the Eastern Front, was about to leave the war because what was going on in 1917? The Bolshevik Revolution, right? And France was severely weakened by the war. So what happened was that for Britain, promotion of Zionism as kind of a counterbalance to Arab influence became part of British grand strategy. And by grand strategy, we're talking not just about winning a war, not just about winning battles, but actually, winning territory. And the British government hoped that Russian Jews who were active in the revolutionary movement might be persuaded to encourage Russia to remain on side, and that influential American Jews might encourage US President Wilson to enter the war. And as well, the British Prime Minister at this time was David Lloyd George, who was a kind of radical liberal, was highly sympathetic to the Zionist cause and to the plight of European Jews who'd been displaced by war in the East and were facing continuing pogrom culture, particularly in Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. And there was also a certain degree of philo-Semitism, sort of the opposite of anti-Semitism in certain sectors of British society, was rooted in Christianity, fascination with the Holy Land of the Hebrew Bible. So people like Lloyd George, Sir Mark Sykes, who we've talked about, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, who we're about to talk about, were all sort of, if not Zionists, but certainly sympathetic to the Zionist cause to one degree or another. And another great Zionist sympathizer and sort of aristocratic British philo-Semite was, of course, Winston Churchill. But there was also fear that European Jews, in fact, supported Germany, given the huge number of Jews who were fighting in German and Austro-Hungarian uniform. And also the influence of Chaim Weizmann, who was an ardent Zionist, originally from Russia, and was a chemist whose research was critical to the wartime British arms industry. And Weizmann was a persuasive public speaker and conversationalist. He was highly influential as a promoter of Zionist cause in the British government and media. So it was intense lobbying on the part of Weizmann and his supporters that led to the British government issuing one of the single most important documents in contemporary Jewish history. And we know that that is the Balfour Declaration. So the Balfour Declaration reads, and most of us are probably quite familiar with it. I'll read from the important central paragraph. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So it's widely understood. The Balfour Declaration is kind of widely understood as one of the foundation documents of the state of Israel. But there's a lot of ambiguity. It's a deeply, deeply ambiguous document. So let's dissect it a little bit. So it talks about a national home. And that sort of seems to acknowledge, to some degree, that question of Jewish indigeneity, right, in Palestine. But there's nothing here about a true nation state, right? There seems to be this implication that a national home would somehow be subordinate to British hegemony. And then there's this reference to existing non-Jewish communities. So can that be interpreted as granting equal status to Palestinian Arabs or not, right? That's not clear from the Balfour Declaration. And finally, there's this question of the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And that could be interpreted as an attempt to limit any subsequent Jewish emigration to Palestine by reassuring diaspora Jews, miraculously, given everything we know about Jewish life in 19th and early 20th century Europe, somehow reassuring them that their status would improve in their countries of origin. Nevertheless, the Balfour Declaration became a component part of the 1922 Mandate for Palestine, which was a League of Nations, as we know, an unsuccessful forerunner to the United Nations, a League of Nations instrument essentially ceding Palestine to Great Britain and Lebanon to Syria and Syria to France. Oh, where we go. So the mandatory document, which I won't quote from, reiterates the idea of Palestine as a Jewish national home. It empowers a Jewish agency to advise and cooperate with the administration of Palestine in economic, social, and other matters as may affect the interests of the Jewish population in Palestine. Also, the mandatory document specifies the facilitation of Jewish immigration and encouragement of settlement on the land. So, everything seems to be going well at this point for the Zionists, going well for the Jews. So how do you think the Arab world, especially Palestinian Arabs, kind of felt about all of this? Well, here's something that kind of gives us a hint of that. This is the resolution of the Syrian General Congress at Damascus. And they say, we oppose the pretensions of the Zionists to create a Jewish commonwealth in the southern part of Syria, known as Palestine, and oppose Zionist migration to any part of our country, for we do not acknowledge their title, but consider them a grave peril to our people from the national, economic, and political points of view. Our Jewish compatriots shall enjoy our common rights and assume the common responsibilities. So you can tell from language like this that the Palestine Mandate for Britain was a little bit of a poisoned chalice, right? And largely of its own making, because from the outset, they were trying to manage the expectations of all of these different parties in the mandate. So first of all, you had the Jews in Palestine and in the diaspora and in Britain, who fully expected Britain to make good on the idea of a Jewish national home, right? That was promised in the Balfour Declaration. On the other hand, you've got the Palestinian Arabs and a wider Arab world whose hopes for fair treatment from the victorious allies, especially Britain and France, seem to have come to nothing. So you know, and certainly from an Arab perspective, Jewish or British policy in Palestine seemed from the very beginning to heavily favor Jews. And this was true to some extent. As above, the Balfour Declaration still was very much a policy component underpinning the Palestine Mandate, but there were some other really important factors at work as well. And one of those was self-governance, because from the very beginning of the mandate, the Jewish community in Palestine essentially had its own government, right, under the auspices of this Jewish agency, which had been actually authorized by the ballot, or called for by the Balfour Declaration, and then authorized by the League of Nations. And the Jewish Agency for Palestine ran hospitals, and there was universal medical insurance for Jews in Palestine. They ran schools. There was the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. It ran labor and trade union organizations. It established courts. It collected taxes. And it even formed a nascent army in the form of this kind of clandestine defense organization, a Haganah, that was set up to defend Jewish settlements from Arab attacks. So this meant that the Jewish population of Palestine had a number of things going for it. It had high rates of literacy. It had a high degree of organization and community. It had an economic base and a very well-trained professional army with which to defend itself. So from the very beginning, whatever the Balfour Declaration said, whatever the League of Nations said, Jews in Mandate Palestine thought of themselves as a state. But the roots of some of the divides in contemporary Israel also began to emerge in this period. And what's also important here is that there started to be a lot of factionalism between different Jewish demographics. So on the one hand, you had labor Zionists who largely controlled the Jewish agency. They were primarily socialists. They envisioned a future state with good relations and equality between Arabs and Jews. They believed that Zionism, with its emphasis on working the land and building up the economic viability of the state, would be good for Arabs too. A rising tide lifts all boats, right? Revisionist Zionists explicitly demanded a Jewish state, not merely a homeland or a shared state. And they fully admitted that their claim on the land was inconsistent with Arab aspirations for some kind of Palestinian Arab state, but particularly as the plight of European Jewry became ever more desperate and ever more apparent in the 1930s, they insisted that the Jewish moral claim to the land outweighed that of the Arabs. And in 1937, revisionist Arab leader, and by the way, this is an interesting photograph showing people who think of themselves as a state long before there was a state of Israel. But revisionist Zionist leader Vladimir Jabotinsky stated that given the fact that the Arabs already had several states and the Jews had such great need for just one safe refuge, Arab claims on Palestine were like the claims of appetite versus the claims of starvation. Although, that's one way of looking at it, but what Jabotinsky didn't mention is that although by this time, virtually all of the world's Arabs were living under some kind of colonial yoke. And it's interesting also that Ben-Zion Netanyahu, the father of the current prime minister of Israel, was actually Jabotinsky's private secretary. And as we know, in the beginning in the 1970s, the kind of the revisionist Zionism became one of the foundations of the Likud alliance, and which continues to espouse a recognizable revisionist ideology, especially denial of Palestinian sovereignty, obviously in any part of Israel, and any part of Greater Israel, and the annexation of occupied territory. So, majority at this point, we're leading up to the Second World War. The majority of the 500,000 strong Palestinian Arab community were opposed to both the mandate, the British mandate, and to Zionism. And they saw the Balfour Declaration as license for Zionism to create a sovereign Jewish state in Palestine, which they viewed as their land. And kind of like the revisionist Zionists, they had a lot in common with the revisionist Zionists. A lot of Palestinian Arabs were maximalists, like Jabotinsky, and they saw any future independent Palestine as an Arab state only. But the problem was that unlike the growing Jewish community, Palestinian Arabs were not organized. They had no Arab agency, even though the British actually encouraged the formation of an Arab agency as a parallel to the Jewish agency. And one of the reasons for that was that Palestinian Arabs believed that since the mandate instrument specifically referred to a Jewish agency to facilitate Zionist objectives in cooperation with Britain, the formation of an Arab agency would signal acquiescence to the Balfour Declaration and to Zionism. So Palestinian Arab politics, you think Jewish politics is factionalized. Palestinian Arab politics at this time were incredibly factionalized and disorganized. And so despite this lack of cohesiveness within the Arab community, the response to perceived British favoritism towards the Zionist cause provoked resentment and ultimately chaos. And between 1936 and 1939, the last few years leading up to the war, the so-called Arab Rebellion saw thousands of Arabs mobilize across Palestine with strikes, riots, violence against both British authorities and Jewish people and institutions, especially isolated farms and kibbutzim. And one of the chief instigators, and this is interesting because now we're starting to get the beginnings of the problems that we're facing in the modern age. And one of the chief instigators of the Arab revolt was a guy called Izz ad-Din al-Qassam. He was a Muslim cleric and holy warrior, characterized himself as a holy warrior, a mujahideen, and he was killed by the British, but in his martyrdom, he gave his name to what would become the Al-Qassam Brigades, which, as we know, is the military wing of Hamas. And his ideology of Palestinian and Islamic liberation became one of the primary inspirations for people like Osama bin Laden and one of the inspirations for the founding of Al-Qaeda, right? So we're talking about things that have very, very deep roots. And meanwhile, faced with what appeared to be an intractable and uncontrollable problem, British authorities recognized the Haganah, the secret army, as a legitimate Jewish self-defense force and enlisted its its assistance in suppressing the insurrection, which politically was probably not that great a decision. But by the time it all petered out in 1939, when the war began, there were 15,000 armed, open, overt Haganah members in Palestine, 15,000 of them compared to a British army presence of 25,000, which meant that 60% of the military strength in Palestine was actually Haganah members. So the intractability of the problem and the Arab rebellion had two major effects on British Palestine policy. The first was a huge incentive to offload what had turned into a major problem. So in a series of British government reports, notably the Peel Commission report, the White Paper on Palestine, the British government announced its intention to create an independent state of Palestine within a decade. And second, given what the British saw as the impossibility of reconciling and combining their national ideals, that state would be partitioned, in effect, dividing it between Arabs and Jews. And the British justified this. This is really interesting. They justified this by observing that Palestinian Arabs were fundamentally, quote, Asiatic in character, unquote, whereas Jews were, quote, predominantly European, unquote. So fundamentally, this is deeply racist, right? But it recognizes also, interestingly, the role of Ashkenazi Jews in the early foundations of the Israeli state, and that this would lead to intra-Jewish conflict in years to come. And we'll talk a little bit about that probably in our next class. But they also imposed significant limitations, especially on immigration. The White Paper limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 people over the next 5 years. So we're talking about the late 1930s, followed by a complete halt until Palestinian Arabs agreed to allow further immigration, right? So given that some 60,000 refugees from Nazism had entered Palestine in the years between 1933, when Hitler came to power, and 39, when the war broke out, this was incredibly short-sighted and basically incredibly cruel, especially given what was about to happen in Europe. So, and here are a couple of illustrations that you can see the Haganah at work. So what are some of the conclusions that we can kind of come to here? Well, and this shows us, this is Jewish-owned land in Palestine by 1942. So you can see how these maps have progressed over 60 years. So inescapably, Britain seemed to favor the claims, certainly from an Arab perspective, seemed to favor the claims of European Jews, at least at the beginning. And not only were they dismissing the counterclaims and the warnings and the concerns of Palestinian intellectuals and Arab statesmen, but they were actively duplicitous. They broke their promises to the Arabs, despite Arab allegiance and sacrifice in defeating the Ottomans. And there was a distinctly Occidental, Western, even racist element to this apparent favoritism. The Peel Commission, with its sort of duality between European versus Asiatic people, and the philo-Semitism that was rooted in Christian sentimentality. And it's true that the early Zionist arrivals in Palestine were desperate people, right? They just as our grandparents and great-grandparents were, these were desperate people fleeing the worst kind of eliminationist anti-Semitic despotism, but they had a number of advantages over the pre-existing population, particularly the Arab population. They had access to money in the form of international and philanthropic organizations, and that allowed them to purchase land, as we can see. And in so doing, not only if not displacing Arab residents, then altering traditional economic and social structures. And this also allowed them to work the land in completely different ways, often using European and American technology, creating efficiencies and maximizing productivity. Until Zionists showed up in Palestine, people were plowing the way people had plowed in the Bronze Age, right? With wooden plows, often hauled by people. And with money from the Rothschilds and Moses Montefiore and Baron de Hirsch, early Zionist, the Hallutzim were able to use Massey Ferguson tractors. So this created efficiencies and it maximized productivity. And this, coupled with the ability to finance the development of an industrial base, because there was Jewish industry in Palestine by the 1920s, meant that there were large and continually growing economic disparities between the two communities. And I think the other really important thing is that 2,000 years of diaspora living, more or less completely outside of host cultures, gave incoming Jews experience in developing these also important social, economic, and governance structures that were kind of completely Jewish and completely independent. And despite this kind of strong tradition of philosophical nationalism that kind of underlay the Arab awakening, the Palestinian Arabs' primary experience was of the increasingly sclerotic Ottoman Empire. And even Jewish underground organizations were nimble, they were highly adaptive, and so really a Jewish state was a fundamental reality almost from the earliest days of the Zionist enterprise. And Jews benefited from a degree of self-determination. They said, we will go to Palestine, we will resurrect the Jewish state, seemingly aided and abetted by foreign powers. But for Palestinian Arabs, they saw their future as being decided by those very foreign powers, Britain, France, the League of Nations, with little input from Palestinian Arabs themselves. Okay, so we're on time. So I'm going to conclude by talking about the post-war period, sort of what takes us up to 1948. And so obviously, you know, what we haven't talked about yet and is the show, is the Holocaust. And obviously the world's response to that requires a unit, if not an entire course in its own right, and certainly much better minds than me have done that. But after the war ended and the truth had sunk in, 6 million Jews, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population had been systematically murdered by the Nazis. And at war's end, you had these 250,000 displaced Jews, 250,000 with no place to go. They tried to go home. Remember Kielce, Poland, a riot in Kielce, Poland, when Jews tried to come back and reclaim the houses that had been taken from them, the homes and the businesses. There was this huge riot, and 42 Jews were killed in Kielce, Poland in 1946. A year and a half after the war was open. So the United States urged Britain to open up immigration to Palestine to allow in at least 100,000 people, but Britain refused, and they stuck to those figures derived from the Peel Commission report and the 1939 White Paper. So the Jewish Agency worked to get survivors out of DP camps and onto this kind of hastily organized flotilla of ships, essentially smuggling them across the Mediterranean and into Palestine. Between 1945 and 1948, the British captured more than 50,000 Jewish refugees at sea and imprisoned them in detention camps, sometimes in Palestine, sometimes in Cyprus, but often sending them right back to Europe to the DP camps, which were actually reconfigured concentration camps that they just escaped from. And this is a famous photograph of British soldiers hauling this guy off a ship at the docks in Hamburg, and he's going straight back into a concentration camp. And so this British intransigence had two effects. It consolidated Jewish resistance to British rule in Palestine, and this included the formation of what we can call terrorist groups that targeted British personnel and infrastructure. And the revisionist Zionist Irgun under Menachem Begin carried out the 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel, for example, which housed British administrative offices and killed 91 people. But it also roused international sympathy for the plight of post-war Jewish refugees, swaying public opinion in favor of a Jewish state. And I think it's important to understand here, because we're talking about two different groups of people, while the Holocaust is central to the understanding of people here, people in the West, Jewish or not, of a certain generation. The Holocaust happened. I mean, certainly there's Holocaust denial, but certainly for people of our age, for people of our parents' age, the Holocaust is very much part of historical memory. But it didn't figure in the minds of Palestinian Arabs, for whom it was part of a conflict that was far away and in a very, very different place. Palestinian Arabs felt that they didn't perpetrate the Holocaust. And if Europeans thought that they should make amends, they shouldn't do so at the expense of Palestinian Arabs. So as the crisis escalated, Britain submitted the matter to the United Nations. And on November the 29th, 1947, the General Assembly voted to partition Mandatory Palestine into two new states, one Jewish and one Arab. So that was the United Nations partition plan right there. And you can see that this is the Arab, this was the part that was supposed to be Arab. This is the one up here, and then the lighter color was supposed to be the Jewish state. And you can see that things actually worked out rather differently. This is how it looked in 1949 after the war. But David Ben-Gurion took a look at that map, and a lot of his colleagues, a lot of the founders said, no, this is no good. And David Ben-Gurion said, look, this is the best deal we're going to get. We're going to take it. And they took it. And so Britain began to withdraw its forces. And as we know, on May the 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion announced the formation of the State of Israel. And I'm just going to read to you some of the language of the Declaration of the Establishment. He says, the land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and national identity was formed. Here they achieved independence and created a culture of national and universal significance. Here they wrote and gave the Bible to the world. It is the self-evident right, they borrow language from the US Constitution, the self-evident right of the Jewish people to be a nation like all other nations in its own sovereign state. And this is it. This is the next two. I think the next two are very important. It says the State of Israel will be open to the immigration of Jews from all countries of their dispersion, will promote the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants, will be based on the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace taught by the Hebrew prophets, will uphold the full social and political equality of all of its citizens without distinction of race, creed, or sex, will guarantee full freedom of conscience, worship, education, and culture, will safeguard the sanctity and viability of the shrines and holy places of all religions, and will dedicate itself to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. And I think I'm just going to read this last paragraph. In the midst of wanton aggression, we yet call upon the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to return to the ways of peace and play their part in the development of the state with full and equal citizenship and the representation in all of its bodies and institutions, provisional or permanent. So basically what it comes down to in this declaration is that this is a historical state. It is a Jewish state, but also a state in which all inhabitants, all of its citizens may live as equals. But interestingly, there's nothing in the Declaration of the Establishment of the State that gives an indication of what that state comprised or would comprise or how far it would extend. And of course, this becomes a major bone of contention as we move into the post-independence period and up until the present day, up until October the 7th of 2023, and which is where we're going to end next week. So thank you very much. Yes. And thank you for correcting me, by the way.
How does the Palestinians say that they didn't have any connection with the Holocaust if the Mufti was linked with Hitler?
The Mufti, yes, I know, the Mufti.
They sound different.
Well, yeah, I did. I cut out the Mufti. How many people here are familiar with the Mufti?
What?
Yeah, okay. So, you know, it's interesting because there's a real debate going on in Israel right now. Yes, so the British, what the British did in an effort to kind of try to appease the Arabs is they appointed this virulently anti-Semitic character, Hajj Ali Amin al-Husseini. Yeah, I know. I'm just gonna get to my notes here. And as the Mufti of Jerusalem, helps to go the right way, doesn't it? And the Mufti was, as I say, virulently anti-Semitic, and he actually left Palestine at the beginning of the war. The British threw him out. He went first to Iraq, and then made his way to Nazi Germany, where he became quite close with the Nazi high command, and actually succeeded in raising 3 Muslim SS divisions by the end of the war. And this picture here actually shows him with their Albanian. He was he really didn't spend that much time in Bosnia. I mean,
well, according to Kurt Waldheim, who was the SS liaison.
well, yeah, so we want.
It's gonna be quite frequent.
Yes, well, we also don't want to put too much credence in anything that Kurt Waldheim ever said either. So you know, I mean, and I think so. So the question is the degree to which Nazi ideology kind of permeated Palestinian thought, Palestinian thinking. And I actually skipped over this, not because I didn't want to mention it, but simply because I was worried about the time, because I know that it's getting late. But so, and I think that debate continues, and it's very much a debate in contemporary Israel. If you like, I was going to address it next week a little bit more and kind of circle back to this. And you know, there's some very interesting kind of historical, so historical debate going on in Israel right now about the degree to which Nazi ideology again sort of permeated Palestinian thinking. And a lot of it is interesting because it's based on numbers. It sort of becomes a numbers game. And as you know, I mean, by the early 1940s, 120,000 Palestinian Jews had joined the British Army and as part of the Jewish Brigade. And you know, but certainly not as many, but around somewhere between 20 and 40,000 Palestinian Arabs also joined the British Army as well. So, you know, obviously that's not as many as Jewish recruits, but well, no, I'm talking about Arabs who joined the British Army. I don't think we can call the Jordanian Legion sort of a tool of Nazism, seeing as it was trained and led by British officers. But anyway, so you know, it's very controversial right now, and I actually wanted to talk more about it next time. So if that's okay, so I'll kind of defer that and let you know that I'm thinking about it and I'm going to work it into next week. Okay. Yes.
You talked about the Ottoman Empire census of the
Yes.
number of people living in the 30s, for example, or no.
Well,
15, 14.
Mhm.
How many are Muslims? You mentioned numbers for the Jews, but how many Palestinian?
How many Arabs were living in the area as well? I don't have that number at my fingertips, but I'll tell you next week. How's that? I'll check it.
Okay,
Is that
but
okay?
they would have been counted also.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, they would certainly would have been counted, and I'll tell you next week, okay? I'll make a note of that and.
No, it's just a balance.
Yeah.
of How it went.
Yeah.
Through the years.
You know what, it's funny because just before everybody arrived, I had this kind of chart that I prepared for myself that breaks it all down. And I left it, I think I left it sitting on a table over at the King's Library. And I'm desperately trying to sort of remember the numbers, but I'll let you know next week. It's, okay. There were certainly a lot more Muslims, a lot more Arabs than there were Jews living in Palestine. Although again, you know, this wasn't a very heavily populated part of the empire. It was kind of a bit of a backwater, you know.
So you know, obviously.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Which is that.
Mhm. Yes.
In 1841, the Church of Scotland
Mhm.
acquired insurance policies from the Tax-DB,
Mhm.
okay? The Tax-DB went to Palestine was French.
Mhm.
It was not the British had any influence at all.
Mhm.
It was the French that had the special status, whatever they call it, capitulations and privileges. And
Concessions.
yeah, and they were they had the special legal status due to the 1535 Treaty of Malta
Mhm.
between Suleiman and Francis I.
Mhm.
Okay, then in the beginning of the 19th century, you also have Rabbi the Vilna Gaon and Rabbi Alkala. After the Pope was offered to create a Jewish homeland
Mhm.
in Palestine, they actually started the immigration,
Mhm.
not the socialists. Of course, the socialists tried to rewrite history. Okay, but that's always the way of socialists. Anyway, point being is in 1840.
I think everybody tries to rewrite history.
Well, to some degree, some are more, let's say, have greater affinity for integrity.
Mm, okay.
So, anyway, in 1841, the Hasidim went. They found that the entire area from pretty well, Tyre down to Aqaba, from the Mediterranean shore to Oman, was roughly about 100,000 people.
Mhm.
Okay, now, this is an insurance actuary that is gonna issue policies that people are gonna have to pay premiums on.
Mhm.
Anyway, point being is that of that, there were 23,000 that were Jews.
Mhm.
And they were in basically what was known as the pilgrim cities,
Mhm.
about 5 cities.
Mhm.
And the Arabs were about 50% were nomad,
Mhm.
okay? And the rest were town dwellers.
Mhm.
And they basically, anyway, that was the actual landscape
Mhm.
prior to Mark Twain walking across Palestine from 1865 to 1866.
Mhm.
And you should really read Innocents Abroad.
Oh, I have read
That's
Innocence. I have,
okay.
thank you. I have read
Yeah.
Innocence Abroad. So are you challenging me or are you backing me up? Okay, so, but I'm not sure what your challenge is.
Well, no, your insinuation was that you have about 7,000 Jews and a countless number of Arabs. And that isn't the truth.
That's not actually what I
Well,
said.
that's sort of what I heard you say.
Well, that's,
Earlier, so. Yeah.
I was talking about some time before that.
And none of that- Well, no, but in 1855 comes the Happy Union, which basically puts an end to the millet system,
Hmm.
okay? And why was the census taken? Because they wanted janitors. And these little minority communities depended on how many people they had to determine how many children they would take into the census.
Okay, all right,
So, okay.
all right. But I think you may have misheard the numbers that I was using,
Yeah.
but I'll clarify those numbers for you next week, okay? All right. Okay,
I think, can I just ask one last question? How
Yeah,
many
sure.
Spartans were there before, at what time did Spartans start coming? Were there any at 1924?
1880s,
Huh?
1880s.
So they started coming?
right, sorry.
Yeah, from Yemen, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, you said
Yemen,
Yemen, but
the
the
first-
other Arab countries they didn't.
No, I
Oh,
mean,
that's-
Okay.
many of them came later, so.
I think.
And we're gonna talk about that sort of in tremendous influx
Yeah.
of Jews from Arab countries next week.
I think Angus will stay here till midnight answering questions. But at this point, I think we're going to.
I also have to get back to the South Shore and I with.
No, not till tomorrow morning. Okay, thank you very much. Yes. I'm gonna stop. I'm stopping recording right now. Stop the share. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. Gonna stop the
Bye, everybody.